Dive Podcast, straight talk on politics, national security, and America's future. With Robert Johnson and Linda Miller, we cut through the spin, tackle the tough issues, and give you the real story behind today's headlines. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell to stay informed. Okay, let's dive in. Trying to understand a situation like the conflict in Ukraine, it really can feel like, navigating through thick fog sometimes.
The headlines give you snapshots, but rarely the full picture.
Exactly. You miss the different angles, the really deeply held positions, the specific demands, and sometimes those hidden risks simmering beneath the surface.
Absolutely. And to really get a handle on it, you kind of need to filter out the noise and look at the actual inputs. The statements from the main players, the nitty-gritty of proposed deals, and the analysis trying to connect the dots.
And that's exactly what we're setting out to do here. We've gathered quite a bit of material for you: official statements, insights from interviews with world leaders, some analysis from think tanks, all focusing on these recent efforts around settlement talks.
Right. So our mission is to unpack all this, pull out the key insights, the crucial details, and really help you see the landscape more clearly, understanding the positions being stated and, frankly, the huge challenges still ahead.
Think of us as your guides, helping you navigate past those headlines to the specifics. We're looking at how progress is assessed, or the lack of it.
Yeah, the totally different views on who's responsible, what the aims are.
And the actual demands, what each side laid out in these negotiations.
Plus those growing external pressures that just make everything even more complicated.
So let's start by setting the scene. It's fascinating, isn't it, how differently this situation and any sort of potential progress are viewed, even among countries involved in trying to find a way forward.
It really is. And a good starting point for seeing those different views is the perspective coming out of the White House regarding U.S. President Trump's assessment.
Okay.
It's described, according to their statements, with this interesting mix, kind of blend of optimism and realism.
Right, I saw that. The White House stated that U.S. President Trump has a positive attitude towards the progress they're seeing in the settlement efforts, based on, what they observe.
So there's this sense of encouragement being put forward about the diplomatic track, despite, obviously, the ongoing fighting.
But then, almost in the same breath, they add that clarification. He's also described as a realist.
Exactly. They stress that he understands much remains to be done. And this realism, they explain, it comes from the basic fact that you've got two countries at war, and it's a conflict that's been grinding on for a long time now.
Yeah, it's not something you fix overnight.
Yeah.
Deeply entrenched.
For sure. And then there's this very specific claim the White House made about their role in the process.
Ah, yes. Tell us about that.
They stated that the recent second round of direct talks between Russia and Ukraine, the one on June 2nd in Istanbul, happened only thanks to the persistence and determination of the president, meaning U.S. President Trump.
That's quite a statement, asserting direct influence on getting those talks to happen.
It is. And the material we looked at confirmed that those Istanbul talks did involve some concrete steps. There was an exchange of memorandums, with settlement proposals from both sides. And they also apparently agreed on a new prisoner exchange. So the White House view is that these specific developments were a direct result of U.S. President Trump's efforts.
And that fits with the other point they made: U.S. President Trump's stated desire for a quick resolution. It aligns with that positive view of progress and the push for direct talks.
Now, shifting gears slightly, but still on the White House perspective, the sources also touched on sanctions against Russia.
Right. What do they say there?
The White House view is that the American Congress respects U.S. President Trump's position on these anti-Russian sanctions.
Okay, so suggesting alignment there.
And they clarified that, according to them, U.S. President Trump has deliberately kept sanctions as a tool available in his arsenal for potential future use, if needed.
So it sounds like a strategic holding pattern, not necessarily pushing for more right now, but keeping the option firmly on the table as leverage.
That seems to be the message. And it gets particularly interesting when you look at it alongside the proposed new sanctions legislation coming from Congress, which the sources highlighted.
Ah, the bipartisan bill.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Developed by Republican Senator Lindsey Graham and Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal.
And this one has a detail that really, jumps out. The timing. For one, they want to get it adopted by the G7 summit in Canada. That's coming up soon, mid-June.
Right, June 15th to 17th. So they're aiming to potentially make a splash during those major international talks.
And the substance of it, what does it propose?
It proposes imposing a massive 500% tariff on imports from countries that buy Russian energy products and other specified goods.
500%.
500%. The sources specifically mentioned oil products, natural gas, uranium. It's an incredibly high barrier, clearly designed as a major economic weapon.
Aimed at countries facilitating Russia's exports, presumably.
Huh.
But here's the key bit, wasn't there? U.S. President Trump's reported stance on this specific bill.
Yes, that's crucial. The sources report his position is that he does not yet know if he will support it.
So uncertainty from the top, even as the White House says sanctions are in the arsenal and Congress respects his position.
Exactly. He hasn't committed to backing this very aggressive legislative push, even though it has bipartisan support in Congress. It suggests maybe a bit of caution or perhaps a different strategy regarding specific pressure tactics.
It adds another layer of complexity, for sure.
Definitely. And there was one last specific detail from the White House source material before we shift perspective.
What was that?
They stated that Kyiv did not inform U.S. President Trump about attacks on airfields inside Russia.
Interesting. What might that imply? Maybe a lack of close coordination on certain operational details?
Could be. Or just a specific data point included in the briefing material. Either way, it was mentioned.
Okay, so let's piece that together. From the White House, reported positive attitude, but also realism. A claim of direct influence on talks. Desire for speed. Sanctions are available, but uncertainty on this big new congressional bill. And this communication detail, what picture does that paint?
Well, it suggests maybe a focus on facilitating dialogue, perhaps confidence in a personal ability to broker something, but also a pragmatic view of how hard it is. And as you said, this kind of measured, maybe even hesitant stance towards some of the more aggressive pressure tactics being pushed elsewhere in the U.S. system.
And for you listening, understanding these nuances is really important. How might this mix optimism, realism, claims of influence, uncertainty on sanctions actually affect the chances for a settlement? Do these signals help, or do they maybe hint at underlying tensions that could complicate things further?
It's a critical question. Now, let's pivot completely. Let's look at a very different viewpoint, this one from Brazilian President Lula da Silva.
Ah, right. His perspective, shared in an interview, it offers a really stark contrast, doesn't it?
It really does. He made a very striking claim about former U.S. President Biden's past view. He stated that former U.S. President Biden believed Russia must be destroyed.
Wow. That's a powerful and certainly provocative statement about perceived Western aims towards Russia.
It is. And his broader view, captured in that interview, is that while he sees Russia's military actions in Ukraine as a mistake, he also believes Western countries bear a certain responsibility for how things unfolded.
So spreading the blame more widely than narratives that focus only on Russia's actions.
Exactly. And he voiced real concern about Europe. He said he historically saw Europe as being a kind of middle path, more independent.
Wow.
But now, in his view, Europe has basically aligned itself with Washington and is pouring billions into rearmament. And his quote on this was quite direct. If we will talk only about war, there will never be peace.
A strong emphasis on needing dialogue, not just military focus.
Very much so. Now, it's important we add the balancing context that was also in the source material regarding that specific claim about former U.S. President Biden.
Okay, what was that?
The material notes that former U.S. President Biden himself denied this back in February 2023. He stated then that the U.S. and European nations do not seek to control or destroy Russia, and the U.S. doesn't plan to attack Russia.
So we have Brazilian President Lula da Silva's assertion and former U.S. President Biden's denial presented side by side in the material.
Correct. And just to add one more angle on perceived aims, the sources also included Russian President Putin's perspective from autumn 2024.
What was his view?
He stated his view that Washington and its allies intend to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia. And if not outright destruction, then the goal is to reduce it to a negligible role.
So that's the Russian interpretation of Western goals framed in terms of strategic outcomes and Russia's global standing.
Precisely. So when you look at these different statements, Brazilian President Lula da Silva's claim, former U.S. President Biden's denial, Russian President Putin's view on strategic defeat, you get these vastly different, even contradictory takes on the aims of the major players.
And Brazilian President Lula da Silva's viewpoint, with its emphasis on shared responsibility and concern over Europe's perceived shift. It adds a voice that definitely challenges a purely one-sided narrative.
It does. It highlights concerns from a different part of the world about the direction things are heading.
For you listening, hearing these contrasts is vital. It shapes your understanding of the global dynamics. It's not just about Ukraine. It's about these widely different interpretations of intentions, responsibilities, and goals from leaders worldwide, each with their own perspective.
Absolutely. And understanding those big picture perspectives is crucial before we drill down into the specifics of the negotiation table itself.
Right, let's zoom in on those Istanbul talks we mentioned earlier, specifically looking at the memorandums exchanged between Russia and Ukraine, as analyzed in one of our key sources, the responsible statecraft analysis.
This is where the analysis gets really granular, and it reveals just how fundamental the challenges are.
What's the main takeaway from that analysis?
According to this source, looking at those memorandums makes it perfectly clear that without some kind of powerful U.S. intervention based on a detailed U.S. peace plan, a peace settlement is just unlikely to happen.
Unlikely without major U.S. intervention. Why such a stark assessment?
The core reason they give is that the positions laid out by both sides in those documents are seen as fundamentally incompatible. Based on what was actually put on the table, the analysis concludes that neither side is currently interested in an immediate peace on the other side's terms.
Wow. So what does that suggest about trying to solve this just through bilateral talks?
Yeah.
That the gap is currently just too wide.
That's exactly the implication. The gap between what each side demands and what the other is willing to consider is seen as too vast to bridge just by themselves talking. It implies that a major external player identified here specifically as the U.S., with the leverage and maybe the ability to offer guarantees or a new framework, is considered necessary for any real breakthrough.
So direct talks are happening, which the White House highlighted, but the substance reveals this deadlock, according to the analysis.
Precisely. The analysis points to the U.S. role as potentially crucial because, arguably, only the U.S. has that unique mix of leverage, resources, and the potential ability to offer things concessions, guarantees that might actually shift the calculation for both Moscow and Kyiv.
This kind of detail really helps you understand the reality of the peace process beyond just headlines about meetings. It's about these concrete, often clashing conditions.
Let's break down Ukraine's conditions first, as presented in their Istanbul memorandum, according to this analysis. There are several key demands that immediately flag the difficulties.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, Ukraine demands a full and unconditional ceasefire in the sky, on land, and at sea. And this isn't just a goal, it's stated as a necessary prerequisite and precondition for peace negotiations.
So stop all fighting completely before real peace talks can even start.
Exactly. And the source assesses that Russia has already rejected this and likely will continue to. Why? Because from Russia's viewpoint, that would mean giving up its main pressure point, military action, without getting anything in return up front.
Makes sense from a tactical perspective.
The analysis also adds another layer, the type of peace needed. It says a fragile and shaky ceasefire doesn't really serve Ukraine or the West. What Ukraine needs for rebuilding and reforms is stable and durable peace.
Okay, so ceasefire first, but it needs to be solid. What's the second demand from Ukraine?
Second, the demand that any restrictions on the size, deployment, or other aspects of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, VSU, are unacceptable.
So no limits on their own military.
Right. And also unacceptable is the stationing of friendly foreign state troops on Ukrainian territory. This is clearly about asserting military sovereignty, the right to self-defense, and the right to choose potential allies or partners.
How does that square with Russia's position?
It clashes directly. The source notes Russia's stated refusal to accept any Western military presence, seeing it as de facto NATO membership.
And there's a detail about European troops, too.
Yes, the source mentions that European leaders had apparently tied any potential troop deployment of their own to guaranteed American support. But according to this source, the U.S. President Trump administration rejected providing that guarantee.
So that creates a tricky situation. Ukraine wants the right. Russia vehemently opposes it. And the U.S. position on backing potential European involvement was reportedly negative.
Exactly, a complex triangle. Now, the third area from Ukraine's memo concerns sanctions on Russia.
What's their proposal there?
Ukraine proposed that part of the sanctions may be lifted from Russia, but crucially, only gradually and incrementally. And there would need to be a mechanism to snap them back if needed.
So sanctions relief is on the table, but conditional and phased.
Yes. And they also proposed that the frozen Russian sovereign assets should either be used for Ukraine's reconstruction or remain frozen until Russia pays reparations.
How does the analysis see Russia reacting to that?
The assessment is pretty blunt. Moscow clearly will not agree to final peace without the lifting of sanctions, or at least firm assurances that they will be lifted. So sanctions are seen as a major hurdle, with Russia likely demanding full removal as part of any deal.
Okay, so ceasefire, military freedom, conditional sanctions relief. Anything else major from Ukraine's side?
There was one point the analysis flagged as potentially offering some room for compromise, or at least acknowledging external factors.
What was that?
It's the statement. Ukraine is not obliged to be neutral. It can choose membership in the Euro-Atlantic community and strive for accession to the EU. Ukraine's NATO membership depends on consensus within the alliance itself.
Okay, let's unpack that. Not obliged to be neutral, can aim for EU and NATO, but NATO membership depends on the alliance.
Right. The analysis points out that Russia has publicly said Ukraine seeking EU membership is its sovereign right, so that part is less contentious for Moscow.
But the NATO part?
That's the tricky bit. The analysis clarifies that while the document says consensus, NATO accession actually requires unanimous agreement from all existing members.
Unanimity, not just consensus, and the implication of that.
The crucial implication, as the source highlights, is that the U.S. President Trump administration, or any single NATO member government, for that matter, can block Ukraine's NATO membership. Ukraine's aspiration is subject to the political will of others.
A potential veto exists.
Exactly. But this creates complexity for Russia, too, because while a U.S. bloc is possible, other members like Poland strongly support Ukraine joining, and, U.S. administrations change. A future election could reverse a potential veto.
So it's not a guaranteed bloc forever.
Precisely. And because of that uncertainty, Russia's resulting demands regarding neutrality, according to the source, are much stricter. They want either a constitutional obligation from Kyiv to be neutral, which Kyiv refuses, or a formal treaty between the U.S. and Russia guaranteeing it, or maybe even both. They're seeking a much more solid guarantee.
Okay, so looking at all these Ukrainian demands together, total ceasefire first, no military limits, conditional sanctions relief, look to reparations, right, to pursue NATO, but acknowledging the NATO entry rules. How opposed are these to what we understand Russia's red lines to be?
Based on this analysis, the demands for the unconditional ceasefire, the full military freedom, and especially asserting the right to pursue NATO, even with the caveats, seem to clash pretty directly with Russia's stated core security concerns and objectives.
So where are those perceived narrow areas for compromise, if any?
Well, the EU membership goal seems less of a direct block for Russia, and the framing of NATO membership as dependent on the alliance. Maybe, just maybe, that introduces external factors like the U.S. position as something that could be part of a broader security discussion if the U.S. were willing to engage that way. It's a very narrow potential opening, according to the analysis.
Understanding these specifics really helps you, the listener, see the concrete hurdles. It's not just abstract disagreement. It's about these very particular conditions on fighting, territory, military power, money, and future alliances.
Absolutely. Now let's flip the coin and look at Russia's stated conditions from their memorandum in Istanbul, again, as viewed through this analysis.
And the analysis noted up front, these are seen
as completely unacceptable to Ukrainians. That really sets the stage for the huge gap we're talking about.
Okay, what's Russia's first big demand?
First, a demand for the full withdrawal of the VSU Ukrainian armed forces from the Donbas, Kherson, and Zaporizhia regions. Basically, Ukraine must pull its troops out of large swaths of its own territory currently occupied or claimed by Russia.
Ceding control of occupied regions.
Yeah.
How does the analysis view the feasibility of that?
Unequivocally, the assessment is this only happens if Russia wins decisively on the battlefield. The analysis states Ukraine will never voluntarily surrender territory. And crucially, European countries will not agree to stop supplying weapons needed for Ukraine to defend itself. So demanding withdrawal without military defeat is seen as a non-starter currently.
Did the Russian memo offer any alternative ceasefire terms?
Yes. There was reportedly a second option detailed. This one focused more on limiting Ukraine's military capabilities and support.
What did that involve?
Things like banning the redeployment of Ukrainian forces, ending mobilization and starting demobilization, and crucially, halting all foreign military supplies and assistance, including things like satellite comms and intel sharing.
And the assessment of that option?
Same assessment, seen as achievable only if Russia wins militarily. The analysis concludes Ukraine and Europe simply won't agree to terms that effectively disarm Ukraine and cut off its lifeline without being forced to by a military outcome.
And what does Russia demand in return for a ceasefire under these terms?
According to the source, they demand international recognition of Russian sovereignty over those regions: Donbas, Kherson, Zaporizhia, and also Crimea.
International recognition of the annexations. How realistic is that seen to be?
The source calls this demand completely hopeless.
Why hopeless?
Because not only will Ukraine and the West never legally recognize it, but even countries sometimes seen as more neutral or closer to Russia. The analysis specifically names China, India, South Africa, have consistently refused to recognize these annexations and show no sign of changing. Global political non-starter.
So the analysis suggests the best Russia might hope for on territory status is kicking that can down the road, postponing the legal decision.
Yes, potentially postponing it to future talks, maybe similar to what was reportedly discussed way back in March 2022.
Okay, beyond territory and military limits, what other demands were in the Russian memorandum, according to the source? This is where it gets into Ukraine's internal affairs, right?
Exactly. A whole range of demands touching on Ukraine's internal politics, society, culture.
Like what?
Setting a date for presidential and parliamentary elections in Ukraine quite soon after martial law ends, no later than 100 days.
A loss.
Demanding maximum limits on the size of Ukraine's forces, the amount of weapons and equipment, even their characteristics, reinforces the military constraint theme.
Okay.
A legal ban in Ukraine on the heroization and propaganda of Nazism and neo-Nazism, and dissolving nationalist groups and parties.
Right, that's been a recurring theme.
Also, restoring the rights of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and lifting restrictions against it. A religious dimension.
Was there anything Russia demanded that the source saw as potentially reasonable?
Yes, actually. The demand for any final treaty to be approved by a legally binding UN Security Council resolution. The analysis commented this specific point makes great sense for ensuring international backing.
Okay. What else was on Russia's list?
Ensuring full rights for the Russian and Russian-speaking population and granting the Russian language official status in Ukraine.
Language rights, minority rights.
And finally, a waiver of mutual claims for damages from the hostility. So essentially, no reparations either way.
That is a very expensive list, covering territory, military elections, history, religion, language, reparations, everything.
It really is. And the source's overall assessment of many of these conditions, it'll be exceptionally difficult for Kyiv to agree to them under pressure.
Why difficult?
Partly because, as the analysis points out, many of these would require legal approval from the Ukrainian parliament, the Verkhovna Rada. And the analysis suggests the parliament is unlikely to grant approval for many of these demands. It's a major internal political hurdle for Ukraine.
So even if negotiators agreed, getting it ratified would be tough.
Very tough. And this brings the analysis back to its earlier conclusion. From their perspective, only Washington has the clout to offer compromises elsewhere, maybe on U.S. forces in Europe, is the example given that could potentially persuade Moscow to soften these extensive terms.
And only Washington could then pressure Kyiv and Europe to accept compromises.
That's the argument presented. Interestingly, the analysis does find some nuance on the demands about minority rights, the Russian language rights.
How so?
It views those as potentially legitimate and necessary if Ukraine genuinely wants to join the EU, since respecting minority rights is a core EU requirement.
Framing it as an EU accession step.
Exactly. But the key, according to the analysis, is that they must be framed for Ukraine as part of the EU accession process, not as a surrender to Moscow. That reframing is seen as crucial for any chance of domestic acceptance in Ukraine.
So stepping back, how unrealistic are Russia's core demands, especially on territory and military limits, based on this analysis?
The analysis paints them as highly unrealistic under current conditions, demanding withdrawal without military victory, severe military caps, basically unacceptable to Ukraine and its partners right now.
And the demands about Ukraine's internal affairs, language, religion, elections, history, what does their inclusion signal about Russia's goals?
It suggests Russia's aims go well beyond just military security. They seem to include wanting fundamental changes inside Ukraine, its governance, its social fabric, its national identity.
Seeing these specifics from Russia's side and the analysis of feasibility really helps you, the listener, grasp just why agreement is so incredibly challenging. The starting positions aren't just far apart. The analysis calls them fundamentally incompatible on multiple critical issues.
And moving beyond just the negotiation points themselves, that responsible statecraft analysis also looked at the wider context, the growing risks if the conflict continues. This part highlights some pretty serious potential dangers, especially for the United States.
Right. The analysis said that while maybe the U.S. President Trump administration feels some irritation with the peace process,
Understandably, perhaps?
walking away entirely would be a mistake, even from the viewpoint of their own interests.
Yeah. The argument is that Washington will inevitably get pulled back in eventually. The U.S. is just too central to the whole dynamic to stay out completely in the long run.
And the analysis specifically flagged 3 recent events. Why?
To underscore how the conflict dragging on the protraction is directly linked to serious risks for the U.S.
And it's crucial for you listening to understand this isn't just happening over there. It has real potential to spill over and create dangers that affect major powers like the U.S. directly.
Absolutely. Let's look at the first risk they identified, nuclear security.
Okay, what was the concern?
The source pointed to a specific incident, a destructive strike by the VSU Ukrainian armed forces against the Russian nuclear bomber fleet, reportedly occurring just the past weekend.
A strike against nuclear-capable bombers.
Yes, and the analysis argues this directly undermines nuclear security between the U.S. and Russia.
Well, what's the danger there? Hitting assets linked to nuclear deterrence.
Exactly. It raises the risk of miscalculation, hitting strategic assets, crossing red lines inadvertently. It increases tension and the potential for dangerous escalation between the 2 main nuclear powers.
Okay, that's a serious one. What was the second risk?
The second risk ties back to that sanctions bill we discussed earlier.
The bipartisan one in the U.S. Congress with the 500% tariffs.
That's the one, proposed for countries buying Russian oil and gas.
And the analysis saw a problem with it.
Yes. While the target is assumed to be China, the analysis makes a critical point. The senators behind it seem to have forgotten about India and other U.S. partners.
India. Why is that significant?
Because, the analysis states very clearly, India has no intention of obeying U.S. dictates that would force it to stop buying Russian energy. Doing so would massively increase its energy costs and hurt its economy. India will prioritize its own interests.
So the potential consequence of these tariffs.
The stark conclusion in the analysis is the 500% tariffs will themselves destroy vital U.S. relations in Asia. This attempt to pressure Russia could severely damage key U.S. partnerships.
So it really shows that tension. Trying to punish Russia versus maintaining complex global relationships. A policy aimed at one could backfire badly elsewhere.
Precisely. It highlights those potential unintended consequences. Now, the third risk area identified involves incidents at sea.
Maritime incidents, how so?
This comes up because the EU recently approved new sanctions, including measures against the so-called shadow fleet, those internationally flagged tankers used for Russian energy exports.
And how is that seen by countries buying that energy, like India again?
The source describes it as another insult. Their perspective is that this trade is legal under international law because the Western sanctions weren't UN approved or agreed to by them. They don't see these tankers as illicit.
Okay, so disagreement on the legality. Were there specific incidents mentioned?
Yes, the analysis gave concrete examples of recent rising tensions. An Estonian patrol boat tried to board a tanker heading to Russia in international waters.
What?
Moscow scrambled a fighter jet to warn off the Estonians, a direct military interaction.
Well, any others?
Finland and Sweden were also mentioned as threatening to arrest such vessels. And Russia itself briefly detained a Greek tanker, Liberian flagged, in its waters after it had reportedly left Estonia.
So multiple friction points at sea.
Yes. And the source included a quote from a senior Russian defense official, Alexei Zurevlev, saying, "Any attack on our vessels can be considered an attack on our territory, even if the ship is under a foreign flag."
That's a very strong statement, treating interference with these tankers as an attack on Russia itself.
It is. And the conclusion the source draws from all this is worrying. If sides maintain their positions on these shipments, maritime collisions are not only possible, but inevitable, a direct risk of physical clashes.
And there was a link made to NATO.
Yes, a crucial one. The analysis states, "It is also obvious that NATO members will never engage in such recklessness without being firmly sure that in the event of a real collision, the U.S. military will come to their aid."
Meaning, any clash involving a NATO member could potentially trigger the alliance's collective defense, draw the U.S. in.
That's the clear implication. A local maritime incident could escalate dramatically, potentially involving the U.S. military directly against Russia.
So, given these risks, nuclear security, economic blowback from sanctions, maritime clashes involving NATO allies, what was the final recommendation from the analysis regarding the U.S. President Trump administration?
It was quite forceful. That it's time to rein them in, and very harshly. Meaning, the U.S. needs to exert strong control over allies to prevent actions that could lead to dangerous escalation.
But they also said the U.S. needs to keep trying for peace.
Yes, that's the other side of the coin. While reining in potential recklessness is needed, the U.S. also needs to continue attempts to end the Ukrainian conflict. Why? Because the longer it continues, the higher the risk of a local collision between Russia and members of NATO, after which the U.S. will no longer be able to stand aside. Ending the conflict itself is seen as key to reducing these risks.
These specific examples, the bomber strike, the tariff bill, the tanker incidents, they really illustrate the tangible, immediate risks, don't they? It's not abstract.
Not at all. Real military interactions, potential economic warfare hitting allies, physical confrontations at sea, each carries huge escalation potential.
And the point about NATO members assuming U.S. backup really underscores how quickly things could widen. Actions by one ally could have massive consequences for the whole alliance, especially the U.S.
It absolutely does. These aren't just far-off possibilities. The analysis presents them as real-world tensions you need to be aware of, directly linked to the conflict continuing.
Okay, let's try to tie these threads together. We've looked at the different takes on progress, the White House view, versus the analysis of incompatible demands in the Istanbul memos.
We've heard the contrasting perspectives on blame and aims from leaders like Brazilian President Lula da Silva, compared with statements attributed to former U.S. President Biden or Russian President Putin.
We dove deep into those specific clashing demands from Ukraine and Russia, laid bare in the memorandums, that huge gap.
And we explored the analysis pointing to the need for external, specifically U.S. intervention for any breakthrough, alongside those mounting external risks. Nuclear security, trade wars, direct clashes at sea.
And just to reiterate, we've presented all this as it appeared in the sources we examined. We included conflicting views, different analyses without taking a side ourselves. The aim was just to convey the information and perspectives contained in the material so you can see the different facets.
Right. And the reason this detail matters, why we do these deep dives, is that understanding these specifics, the White House nuance, Brazilian President Lula da Silva's different angle, the actual demands on paper, the concrete risks like those tariffs hitting India or ships clashing, it gives you a much richer, more, real picture than headlines usually offer.
It helps you see why peace is so incredibly difficult to achieve right now. It's not just a lack of will, it's these concrete, stated positions that are currently seen as fundamentally incompatible. And you see the real stakes, the potential for this to escalate and impact the wider world.
Hopefully, seeing those demands side by side or grasping the potential fallout from something like that 500% tariff bill on U.S. relationships provides those moments of clarity, those aha moments that cut through the noise.
So as we wrap up, here's a final thought, prompted by everything we've just discussed from the sources. Given this deep incompatibility in negotiating positions we saw in the Istanbul memos, and these escalating external risks, does a path to peace require one side to fundamentally change its core demands? Or is external pressure and compromise the only realistic way forward?
And if it is the latter, who actually has the power and the will to apply that pressure effectively and broker those tough compromises?
It's a really challenging question that emerges from the material without a clear answer provided. Definitely something to think about as you continue to follow this situation.
Indeed. Food for thought.
Subscribe to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We are here to make things clear. New episodes every day.